Hello, everyone. This is Mad Cat, and welcome to another of one of my fabulous shows. But this time it's going to be different because I have Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, who is a professor at the University of Chicago, who teaches on a variety of subjects, but has a primary focus on the Middle Ages, which is going to be our topic today. How are you doing, Rachel?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Is it fine that I call you Rachel?
That's fine.
Oh, okay.
We're in YouTube world. I think, yeah, first names. If you were in my class, you'd have to call me Professor Fulton Brown, but you know.
So Rachel here has been in the news recently, which is how I found out about her. I actually have to thank Janice Fiamingo for making a video about her. But apparently she wrote an article 3 years ago where she praised white men. And I guess suddenly a feminist social justice warrior type found
it. Took her 6 months. No, it wasn't immediate. It was about 6 months after I put the post up. Yeah.
Okay. But you posted it 3 years ago.
I did.
So why was it in the news recently then? If it was...
Well, that's a good question because this is an ongoing debate in medieval studies now, thanks somewhat to me posting that blog post 3 years ago. And Professor Fiamingo did the video where she says, oh my God, she cheered for white men. The post is called 3 Cheers for White Men. And a colleague of mine in medieval studies found it, posted it in a Facebook group in January 2016. I made a series of responses in the Facebook group and then on my blog. 6 months after that, I made friends with Milo Yiannopoulos. And this created some stir among my colleagues in the academy because they don't pay as much attention to Milo as they should and don't understand him as well as I do. And that same colleague who'd found the 3 Cheers post along with some others spent the next year basically calling me names on the internet, on Facebook and Twitter. I pushed back against that in some of my blog posts, gently, right, in that conversation. There was also an article that I wrote about Milo for a newsletter at the University of Chicago. Eventually, it seemed to me that I needed to make some comment directly about what had been said about me, and I did a post about a year ago in response to an argument that if you in medieval studies are not willing to get up in front of your class and say you're explicitly not a white supremacist, your students will assume you are. So I thought that was silly because to assume that someone, just because we're teaching the Middle Ages, is a white supremacist is making a huge leap. And so I wrote a post called How to Signal You're Not a White Supremacist. And I said, I guess I have to do it. How am I going to do it? Well, I study the Virgin Mary in the devotional context in which I work. Mary is often described as dark, right? There's liturgical chants that are used to say she's black but beautiful. There's artworks that depict her as dark-skinned. There's scholastic university treatises that talk about how she had dark hair and dark eyes. I'm not much of a white supremacist if, in fact, the person to whom I've dedicated my life is described in these terms in the period in which I study. And then I ended that with, okay, and if you don't think this is persuasive, the best way to show that you're not a white supremacist is to learn some history. Because if you study the Middle Ages, you understand it's much more complicated than any sort of caricature representation that certain groups might be using in the modern period. That got me into the news because it was said that by answering the argument that I had in the way that I had put a colleague in physical danger. This is nonsense. But because I'm friends with Milo, they used it to build up this whole repertoire of claims that my blogging was dangerous to the community, to these particular people, to the academy. And they spent this last academic year making those allegations, and sometimes in professional contexts. And so Milo wrote an article this summer about this long-running debate. It's on Dangerous, called Middle Rages. And that's how Professor Fiomingo found out about it, that she read his article. So why am I still in the news? Well, clearly it's you know, the Middle Ages, contrary to popular representation, really matter. And so I'm happy to be here to talk about why that is the case, because I think that's actually the more interesting part of the argument. Well, although I love talking about Milo. You can always ask me about that.
Well, the way I see it is, this is the closest I've ever gotten to Milo. I'm like one person away.
There you go. Handshakes, networks.
So hopefully in 10 years I can meet him. But I definitely agree with you. Well, my position is all of history is important to learn. But more specifically, the Middle Ages may have the biggest impact on our society as a whole. And I know that's hard to fathom for some people, because we are talking about a history that ended 500 years ago. And a lot has happened since then. But, you know, with the fall of the Roman Empire to pretty much the Renaissance, there is just a lot of turmoil that happened. There was a lot of good things that happened, but a lot of bad things. And, you know, you have to take the good with the bad. You can't just focus on the good or just focus on the bad. But it seems people today are not even just focusing on the bad. They're trying to find new things to be upset about when it comes to the Middle Ages. So I guess,
well, in those terms, what they're doing is in fact the project of modernity. And I think if you want to know why we even talk about the Middle Ages in the first place, it's because that earlier period, and you say it ended 500 years ago, that's just saying periodizations don't exist, right? And that's one of the, there's sort of reifying these entities as if the in Middle Ages was a real thing. It's a story. You're a storyteller, right? It's a frame for telling a particular story about European history. And one of the curious things that my colleagues who are, you know, pushing back against me and calling me names are saying is the Middle Ages weren't just white. And I'm like, that isn't even a meaningful claim, right? It's the Middle Ages are a framing device for telling a particular story about a part of world history. You don't talk about the Middle Ages in China, right? That's a, you can say there, you know, contemporary developments in China with the period that we call in Europe the Middle Ages, but to say that Chinese history matches the structure of Europeans telling their own history, I mean, that is, you know, sort of intellectual imperialism at its worst, I would say, because you're not actually understanding that different parts of the world went through different processes of development. So, you know, the Middle Ages, insofar as they're an intellectual concept, are useful for thinking with, but they don't exist as this land that you go visit, as it were. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just thinking about cable. Medieval times. I'm sorry,
but no, cable guy in medieval. We can talk about that too. No, in medieval times, we do not. What's Jean Garofalo's great line? It's like, in medieval times there were no forks, so at medieval times we don't have forks. More Pepsi. They're great. Oh, I love medieval times. We could certainly talk about that. But the dining, the restaurant with the show, right? That's what we mean. The medieval times.
But I do agree with you that, you know, when we talk about the medieval times or the Middle Ages, we're kind of looking at an intellectual snapshot between like 500 AD to 1500 AD around. I'm not using specific dates. And there was a lot going on. And I actually, because I'm a sadist, I like to try to study everything that was happening in the world at that time. But my primary focus right now is just on what was happening in Europe, primarily in France.
Okay.
So let's actually talk about the Middle Ages. So my first question for you, with the students you have, because it seems that a lot of people's understanding of the Middle Ages actually comes from the Victorian age, where as you had said in the pre-show, there was a professional history that started, but people weren't really checking their work to make sure that they were on ball. So these myths have just sort of remained in our society despite many other works suggesting otherwise. So what are some common misconceptions that you're met with as a teacher from your students?
Well, I'm actually fine if they come to my classes with misconceptions. That's the whole point of coming to class, right? And I typically ask them at the outset, sort of, what do you know? And I did a class in this past spring on medieval England. I do others on, like, War in the Middle Ages, and I have actually co-taught a course on knights and samurai. So we did the European Japanese comparison. For those kinds of classes, I ask the students sort of, why are you here? And I'm actually quite heartened by what most people know, because you will not be surprised that a lot of the people that come to my classes with titles like that play video games. And so in fact, what their focus has tended to be is on the visual culture, because the video games that they're playing are quite rich, right? And of course, people who write those games are often very, very interested in kind of details of history and details of warfare and details of sort of landscape and clothing and architecture and things like that. So the students actually tend to come with, it's curiously, detailed and yet vague understanding of the narrative of the history. In terms of the mythology that they're coming with, well, those kinds of stories you'd be more likely to get from movies like Kingdom of Heaven, or I don't know. Monty Python actually is in a category by itself because their jokes are very sophisticated. What are the major myths that people come with? Well, and I don't watch the video games enough to know if these are repeated, but typical myths include the clergy was all horribly lecherous, which unfortunately is kind of in the news right now. It's a problem for the church at the moment. But the stories about the Middle Ages are a little different. Well, no, the stories about the Middle Ages map in unfortunate ways onto some of the concerns right now. So there's concerns about the hypocrisy of the clergy. There are representations of it as backward intellectually, obviously. Some of the ones that you mentioned in the notes you sent me, things like, what the status of women was and things like that. Almost, there are two places that you can trace most of the myths that English-speaking audiences have about the Middle Ages. One is Walter Scott, and the other is Mark Twain. And you as a novelist will therefore appreciate your great power, because whatever academic historians say about the period, the storytellers win. Many of the myths that we have about England and Crusaders come from Walter Scott's books, The Talisman and Ivanhoe. Many of our misrepresentations as Americans about things like the Roman Catholic Church and the technology come from Mark Twain, and particularly Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court. So if you have sort of visions of the Middle Ages as sort of scientifically backward and easily spooked by technology, that's Mark Twain. If you have representations of the Middle Ages as the Templars are all, sort of corrupt and lustful and such, that is Ivanhoe's Brian de Bois Guilbert, who abducts the beautiful Jewess Rebecca of York and tries to persuade her to run away with him to Palestine, where she'll be queen, and she says no. So it's, and then overlaid on all of that are the mythologies that come out of things like the French Revolution, which include stories about feudal lords able to, have sex with the peasants' women the night their marriage. That's an utter fantasy and totally wrong. And we can talk a little bit about why that doesn't exist. But it's there are layers and layers of this mythology, and that was why in my How to Signal You're Not a White Supremacist post, I wanted to say, look, if you really want to understand how mythology is always shaping our perception of the period, you just need to study the historiography of our field, and it immediately gets far more complicated than most people are willing to appreciate.
Wow. I'm going to rewatch this part when we're done, just so I can because that was a lot to unpack, but oh my God.
Yes. Well, and that's why it's hard, right? And so you start with You also made a statement at the outset saying much of what we are now has come from this period. But the thing is, much of what we are now has also come from the stories that we tell about the period. So it's multi-layered, right? That as a historian of the period, you're also having to be aware of the degree to which you participate in that mythologizing in your own interest in the period in the first place, like knights, right?
Well, I was thinking about you talking about the Knight Templars, and
Mm-hmm.
certainly from the game Assassin's Creed, which I've played a number of them, I kind of hate how they portray the Templar Knights because they kind of make them look as very corrupt because they're so connected to the church. So they manipulate people, they push people around, and it's like these were the protectors of people.
Yes, and do you understand why there's that image of the Templars that we wrestle with? Is that something that you've come across?
In parts, yes. Mostly because they were a secret order. They didn't really tell people about what was the ingoings of their organization, which led a lot of people, especially from Philip the Fair, to
There you go.
Yeah, because
why did Philip the Fair accuse the Templars of being so secretive and
because he borrowed a lot of money from them.
Yes.
Unable to pay the debt back.
He wanted to seize their property. This is a tried and true technique on the part of the French monarchy, right? If they're in trouble financially, they cook up ways to take someone else's money. Louis the 11th, the great Crusader king, did that with the Jews. Seized their property in order to finance some of his crusading activities. His great-grandson, Philip the Fair, does it with the Templars. And so most of the stories that come out about the Templars are fictions. They're well, if you watch, things like Supreme Court nominees being put through the trial or ringer by the Senate right now, there's stuff like that, right? They were slanders used to justify shutting the order down and seizing all its property.
So have I impressed you yet that I knew that?
You have, yes. If you want to know the full story, Malcolm Barber is the best historian on the Templars.
Okay.
He did a book on the trial of the Templars that will go through all of those details.
Awesome. I'll definitely check that out.
But it's also, it's interesting what you said with the Assassin's Creed, that it's the Templars are tied to the church. And of course, it's the king using the ideals of the church against them that enables him to seize all their money, right? So that he makes it out as if they're sorcerers. And I think there were accusations of sodomy. So, their sexual sins. Certainly in the period, there are also people that, like to pretend that they have magical powers. They're usually the clergy because they're the ones who can write. And also of the magical treatises that we have, if you really want to go into that, there are magical treatises. Richard Keykefer, my colleague at Northwestern, edited one that he called the Necromancer's Handbook. They tend to be books that you can imagine students using that give you access to wisdom, but without having to read all the books, so that you can do a sort of conjuration of angels and learn all the liberal arts, right? So you can see why that would be quite appealing. There are love potions and things like that in them, but they're not quite what they're represented as in the 19th century as dark magic, right? They are angel magic, but they're often, sort of with the expectation that you can use this kind of magic to it's sort of Faustian, right? You want knowledge, typically, sometimes power, but there are good Marian stories about how that backfires on you, so you don't really want to go there. The devil comes after you.
Well, the most important thing with magic that a lot of writers have done is there's always consequences to using it. So.
Oh yes, good. Yes, no, and that's definite. It's like definite problems with it. What kind of energy you're drawing to yourself by way of those efforts at conjuration. I've taken you way off the topic that you wanted to talk about.
No, this is wonderful. I'm a little selfish here. I brought you on so I could ask all of these questions.
Oh, good. Okay, I'll just carry on then.
So,
Okay. Did I answer the first question, which was where so the misperceptions, they largely come from things like Walter Scott and Ivanhoe and Mark Twain. But there are other things like whether or not, this is one of the scholarly ones that I've worked with, whether or not there's a panic around the year 1000 in terms of whether the apocalypse is going to come. And this is a very interesting scholarly question, because in the late 19th century, there were French historians who were saying, no, there was no sort of panic of year 1000. How stupid do you think people were at the time? And then there are others saying, no, in fact, it did have a sort of strong effect on people's thinking, for example, in interpreting what happened when one of the caliphs in the Holy Land destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 1009, or interpreting, comet that they saw in 1066 when William the Conqueror invades England. And I have written about how I think, in fact, they were paying attention to the calendar, and it changed their devotional life in very significant ways. That you see the generation after the year 1000 developing new kinds of prayers to Christ that are very, very focused on judgment and practices like self-flagellation and meditation on his wounds, which I think was occasioned by attention to the calendar in some of the same way that, present day concerns after the year 2000 are also affected by our sense, it's meaningful, right? And it's not because as a Christian, I might say, yes, I'm expecting the second coming in 2033, but because that would be 2000 years after the crucifixion. But it's more that we are a culture that is very sensitized to this calendar, and in the Middle Ages, that sensitivity is also there, that they think the time is meaningful. That's why they say, this is the year of our Lord, Anno Domini. I mean, technically, this is the year of our Lord 2018, right? And so you're already just in the way in which you tell time, expecting it to have a certain kind of significance. So I think it's silly to say that people didn't pay attention to the year 1000, partly because prior to that, they'd kept changing the calendar so that the apocalypse would be deferred in different ways in other calculations. And trying to make those sorts of arguments, even within the scholarship, is kind of tricky, because you're always pushing back against how, in France, as you said, you're interested in France, right? The French historians in the late 19th century are also very anti-clerical quite frequently. And so they don't want to believe that Frenchmen of the 1,000 years ago were swayed by ecclesiastical arguments. And that goes in a lot of different directions. The anti-Catholicism and anti-clericalism of the scholarship is very tricky to navigate.
Well, since we're talking about clerical, so one of the common things that I've heard about the Middle Ages, which I at first believed, but now I'm starting to really seriously question with a lot of things I've now learned, that they were afraid of technology. That the Dark Ages was called the Dark Ages, not because people painted in dark colors, but because the church had a referendum that, any technology was bad. And I know that's not true, but can you go into more detail about the church and technology?
Sure. And the reason you have that image is Mark Twain, because that's exactly the image that he creates in the Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, that the Connecticut Yankee is sort of the representation of the Industrial Revolution, right? And the premise is he gets cast back into the 5th or 6th century. And when he arrives there, it's all barbaric. But in the story, it's all barbaric because of the Catholic Church. And so he says fantastic things like the Catholic Church invented slavery, which is exactly the opposite. And I mean, the pagan Romans and Greeks had slavery. It's the church that pushed back against it over the centuries. But that Twain creates that image, it just stuck in American culture, right? So of the number of things that you said in asking the question that are inaccurate, people painted in lovely bright colors. The Middle Ages, if you look at medieval art, it's playful and colorful. Lots of jewel tones, right? Rich reds and blues and greens. They're very blues and greens are very expensive colors. But if you go to a cathedral like Chartres, which has its original glass, this is a period in time in which people delighted in color, right? They were making colored windows, right? Think about that. So that the light streaming through would dapple the pavement with brilliance, right? It's like stepping inside of a gym. Churches in the period were also painted colorfully. So we see them now as all, gray stone and things like that. But in fact, that's because in succeeding centuries, either they haven't been kept up or the paint was taken off for different aesthetic reasons, but or the whole building was redone, and that's why the old sculptures aren't there. In Paris, if you go to Sainte-Chapelle, that has been restored in its interior to the way an actual medieval church would look like, and it's just all color and light and brilliance, right? So it's that, just to start with. Middle Ages was a period that reveled in light and color. It also a period that loved technology, and that the 19th century is so proud of itself for its, industrial production. They're looking back to an earlier period in curious ways, blaming it for not being now, right? But in fact, I make a strong argument in my classes when I teach history of European civilization to understand that the Industrial Revolution develops over a long period of time, right? There's a spark and it takes off in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, but medieval civilization has various moments, and you can say it's dark in the sense of underdeveloped and agriculturally backward and things like that. Really, for a specific time for a very particular reason, it's under attack. The Dark Ages, you could say, which do you pick? Do you pick the Germanic invasions of the Roman Empire? Do you pick the Viking, Magyar, Muslim invasions of the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries? As soon as Europe is able to recover from, in various ways, it needs to develop its military response to those invaders. As soon as they're able to start pushing back against those attacks, they begin building cities. They begin, developing new ship technology. They develop new agricultural techniques, the three-field system, animal husbandry. If you, all you need, the one thing you need to, the quickest way to disabuse yourself of this, the idea that medieval Christians hated technology, is walk into a cathedral, right? That you understand that those are buildings that are built with, hammers and chisels, wood scaffolding, courage, because it takes a lot of courage to climb a scaffolding every morning to roof a vault that's that high off the ground, right? It takes architecture, it takes stone cutting, it takes the technology to make those windows. The 19th century created this image of the Middle Ages as technologically backward, while at the same time in the 19th century they're using often medieval models for things like the Houses of Parliament, is sort of mind-boggling, right? It's mind-boggling that Europeans do that to their own story, because if they told it in proper terms, they'd tell a story from around the year 1000 of gradual and continuous development and celebration of craftsmanship and labor and ingenuity and technology.
Yeah, a lot of my focus has actually been on the 14th century, and obviously
gunpowder.
Well, I was thinking about first the mini ice age they had, and then the famine of 1315, then the bubonic plague, and then the peasants' revolt. I mean, that must have been one of the worst centuries in history.
Not good, but to understand,
something bad happens.
Well, and to say, do you understand why the bubonic plague had the effect that it did, or why it was able to spread the way it did?
I've heard a lot of things, and I guess now having you here, I can pick your brain about that. But a lot of what I heard was that, people really only had one set of clothing, that the church frowned upon bathhouses, that people threw away their garbage on the front door, that rivers were contaminated, so people weren't getting fresh water, that people were always in close proximity, especially when they went to bed. Whole families would sleep in the same bed, which would pass around the fleas very easily. So,
okay, there's so many problems there, right? Okay, so the reason it spread so quickly is because Europeans were in close contact with Asia, right? So one of the myths that I was going back to saying, my colleagues in medieval studies that love calling me names right now insist that I don't know that Europeans had contact with the rest of the world. And it's like, yes, I do. And the spread of the Black Death is in fact the most sort of horrific proof of the contact that they had with the rest of Asia, because it seems to have started obviously in China. If you look at the maps of the transmission of the plague, it's plague fleas from inner Asia, and China was devastated by the plague as well. That it brought about brought about a political transformation there too, with the Ming Dynasty came in after the Mongols. The reason that Europeans are so connected with the rest of Eurasia is because the Mongol conquest had broken the Islamic sort of barrier to Christians traveling across Asia. The Mongols for a period are pagan before either they become Chinese or convert to Islam. And so people like the Polos were able to travel all the way across Asia. And those trade routes are the way in which the plague spread, right? And the plague comes from the Crimea initially because the Tartars are besieging a Genoese city, and the Genoese fleeing from their city that plague bodies have been thrown into bring the plague to Italy. The trade networks across Europe spread it very, very quickly. The reason that the plague is able to spread is, in fact, because Europe is so well developed at the time. It has urban populations. It has, when you're talking about the cleanliness concerns, many of those come post-plague because they're trying to contain it, right? Because after 1348, after the outbreak in 1348, plague becomes endemic to Europe for the next several hundred years. And many of the measures that you're describing as, quote, medieval, concerns about cleanliness, concerns about people having privacy and sleeping together in bathhouses and things like that, are all efforts to respond to what they recognize as the devastating effect of this contagion. So quarantine, for example, the ships, if they have plague, are then quarantined off, and you would recognize that as a prudent measure. Prior to the spread of the plague, bathhouses were common, right? It's like if you there's a really good book if you like. Again, France, the Guises, Gies. It's a husband and wife team, I think, that write these books, Life in the Medieval City, and they're talking about Troy. That's right. Yes. And it's bathhouses, right? So in the High Middle Ages, it would be common to go to the bathhouse to wash. After the plague hits, they recognize that people die when they go into these situations, and so they get anxious about it. So bathing, that's one of them. That people, it's true, people didn't have as many changes of clothing, obviously, as we do. The Industrial Revolution brings about textile production at high levels first, right? But the textile trade is the thing that drives drives the European economy. That the wool trade from English sheep going to Flemish textile workers and textile workers in northern Italy. That's, again, those are the regions that get hard hit by the plague because they're very industrialized. They're high density populations because they're craft work. There were other. What else did you ask? Whether people care about.
Well, first off, I apologize because when you asked how it was spread, I was answering once it was already there, not how it initially started.
Okay, so now, but it's
the Mongols,
right? But it spreads. It spreads initially because nobody knows what it is,
right.
And the immediate response is a lot of hypothesizing about how it's. The atmosphere, there's the sort of bad humors have broken out from earthquakes. There's conjunctions of the planets that bring down the bad humors in the atmosphere.
Great conjunction.
Right. But, and some lies about people poisoning wells, Jews poisoning wells, which the Pope steps down on and says, no, they're dying too. That's stupid. Stop blaming them. But the earliest accounts, very earliest accounts, all recognize that it happened across the known world. That people were dying in China, they were dying in Alexandria, they were dying in Constantinople. That it hit everybody, and they knew that because they had the trade networks to bring them that information.
Another thing that came across my research is what also caused the spread of the plague was the 100 Years' War. That soldiers might get affected by it, but they wouldn't know at first, and then desert to a nearby town, and they just brought the plague to that town. So that was another thing that caused it to spread. There's big battles around that time, but
I think what's interesting is I think there's sufficient traffic to spread it without needing the soldiers, right? So the 100 Years' War is happening at the same time, but the regular trade traffic that's crossing Europe at the period is probably much more significant than Edward's campaigns.
So, going to a different direction from the bubonic plague, one of the things that's come up in my research is that prior to the bubonic plague itself, the church still condemned homosexuality and prostitution, but they sort of tolerated it. But after the bubonic plague, when pretty much half of Europe died, they condemned it a lot more, that they really went after people for it, because the church's main focus was, we need to repopulate. We need everyone doing what they can to rebuild our numbers. Is there truth in that?
There's no such thing as homosexuality in the period, because that as a claim is a 19th century construction, that there is such a thing as normal sexuality versus abnormal sexuality. The way the medieval descriptions work on it is there's sexual sins, that sodomy is a practice, right, rather than that you are inclined to do it because you're homosexual. You know, that there are ranges of sins that are include fornication, sex out of marriage, to bestiality and things like that. And you'd be worried about them as being inappropriate sexual acts, not that people who engage them in them are homosexual, right? So that category just in their minds just doesn't exist. There's certainly still prostitution after the Black Death, because a lot of the stories that we have are from late 14th century England that I'm aware of, that colleagues have written about. You know, that there's still obviously regions in London that are considered good for finding women. Right. That prostitution is always a problem, but it's in their eyes, right? Because it's inappropriate sex. But it's usually with the Middle Ages, it's much harder to say the church said X and then not end up with a long line of footnotes about how they either try to regulate it or participate in it or worry about it. With sodomy, the most famous discussion of it as a sin is from the 11th century, so it has nothing to do with Black Death. And it's written by a Italian cardinal, Peter Damian, who is not worried just about sodomy, but clerical celibacy more generally, also clergy buying and selling their preferments, their offices. So it's corruption of the sense of, like we would recognize, big donor gives you money, you get your priestly office or your bishopric or something like that. Peter was very, very concerned about that whole network of sins, not just sodomy. And as far as he was concerned, all of them are ways in which the priesthood is polluted, right? So the church is concerned with helping people live virtuous lives, and what virtue is obviously a important question, but that they're specifically concerned about homosexuality and prostitution. No, we are, right? Prostitution and homosexuality as obsessions are really, again, 19th century concerns, and that we project them back onto their concerns is I think tells more about us than them.
And as you say in your classes, we need to go into their minds and try to understand from their point of view.
Right.
Imbue our sensibility, our morality onto theirs, because it's just not compatible.
Well, a lot of our morality is their morality. We just deny it, right? It's like we expect women to have a particular status in society and to be respected as human beings and to have, be honored and equal. That's all medieval, right? So what's interesting is typically what happened from the 19th century is we take the things that we value about our society, puff ourselves up and say these are our values now, and they didn't have them in the bad old dark ages. And it's like, no, you wouldn't have them if they hadn't been articulating them over centuries. It's taken us centuries to come to an understanding of why these values are so significant to us.
That is definitely true, and I guess I misspoke on that one, because one of the things that I was surprised about is certainly I was I believe, the 19th century story, but that the Middle Ages were actually quite egalitarian. That, well, as far as my research goes, again, it was just in the 14th century, but after the bubonic plague, there are so few people to do anything that they didn't care if you were a man or a woman, as long as the job could get done. That's all they cared about. And
well, okay, so I think what you probably want to read more in is the history of towns, right? Because you're making certain kinds of assumptions, I think, based on like guild regulations, possibly. So people living in the countryside, in my class, one of the texts we use for the 13th century is a document from what are called the 100 Rolls, which are a survey that the king did in order to be able to count his money, right? Most things kings do is about counting their money. And what's interesting about it is it's a detailed enough survey of England that you can look at sort of particular manners, the agricultural system, and see, like who lived there and how many people there were. And in my class, I used one in particular, which the manor of Walton, which was owned by the Abbey of Peterborough. So the lord is an abbot, not the king or some other secular lord. And you can go through this document and see how many free tenants there were. There's just one. There's a certain number of villeins, the unfree people, who's head of households, how many workers you can imagine that they had. And even down to that level of, and this is before the Black Death, right? It's 1279. Down to that level, you can still find women who are heads of the households in peasant households, right? That there are a number of widows that are the ones who are assessed the customary dues to the abbot even in this little manor of Walton, right? It's like the village is still there, and it's I should know how many people there are. It's a few hundred, right? And some of those are households headed by women. That there's a sort of trope. The more you study the Middle Ages, and a few years ago, about a decade ago, my department did a search for someone in social and economic history, and so we got a lot of people writing things about the status of women and such. And it didn't matter which century they were writing about. The status of women was, very, nearly equal. And it's like, oh my goodness. So what you're learning is that, European Christian society valued women throughout, in different ways at different times, but if there's a change after the Black Death, you have to put it in the context of a general systemic appreciation for women throughout the period, the long Middle Ages.
And I think that's the biggest challenge I have with my research, is there is a lot of bias there because, again, 19th century, but also
right.
The values that we have today, like, oh, women have achieved so much in 100 years, and yes, they have, but then it's the assumption that means that they were treated like cattle all those years ago, and it's like,
right,
no,
it doesn't go from cattle to the vote in a generation, right? It's a very long tradition, and it takes a long time for institutions like, I keep mentioning the towns, and that's one of the things that people often ignore about studying the Middle Ages. You think knights, and you think castles, and you think cathedrals. The cathedrals are in cities, in towns, and the towns are developing many of the political institutions that now we depend upon. In the 18th century, they sort of project themselves back into antiquity, and they say that they're borrowing all this stuff from the Roman Republic. But what they're actually thinking through, even in the American colonists, they're thinking through English traditions of common law, which developed out of centuries of town life and government, which expect things like citizenship and guild membership and all sorts of rights and privileges. And I knew there was something else. You were asking about like the sanitation in the period. That one thing we know is that the towns throughout the period are constantly putting up legislation to get people to keep their refuse under control. So you say people living in the towns, if you've ever visited one of the medieval towns that still exist, they're nice places, right? And the people who lived in them at the time tried to keep the refuse and the stink away. And when it got bad, they complained, right? So it's important to recognize that it's not that they're just tolerating it. Oh my God, it smells bad. It's like, no, it smells bad. We need to do something about this. And they do, right? They pass legislation to fine people for littering, and the tanners for making too much smell, and the butchers for not, keeping their animals under control and things like that. So
That's why butchers and blacksmiths were told to be on the outside of town for their craft rather than
right. Because you want to keep the center part pleasant, because it's the rich people, but you want to keep parts of the town very pleasant places to live. And yes, they do have different expectations of hygiene, but that's because they have limited technology. But they do have the monks are, you ask about technology too, monasteries are often the most technologically advanced of the period. And we have a very famous psalter from Canterbury, a monastery in Kent, that includes a diagram of its basically its running water sewer system, right? That these monasteries would have sort of channeled water courses to take away sewage. So the latrines were quite, running water, literally. But the water would also do things like run water mills and other water-driven machinery. So they're actually, this is in the 12th and 13th centuries. This is actually quite technologically sophisticated, and it's the monks who have the wherewithal and the technological expertise to be able to develop these systems.
Well, you mentioned water, and that's often something I hear, that people didn't really drink water. They would either drink wine or drink beer.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true?
That is more true, yes, because ale in England particularly, and the women were the ones that typically did the ale making. That is true, that it's better to have the fermentation to kill off whatever's living in the water. But they're aware of that, right? Which is why the ale and wine are weaker than ours, I think. So, although people did drink a lot, yes, both things are true.
Well, of course, children would drink milk because they would be too young for the alcohol.
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I can keep giving you references because I know you want to read up on this. There's a really good book by Barbara Hannawalt called Growing Up in Medieval London. And what we have in details about children in towns is typically from people who are apprentices. So they're, 7 years old, or from 7 years old or on, the contracts that they make with the masters. And some of those, there's some pretty horrific stories about how badly these apprentices were treated. But on the other hand, again, you get the bad stories because those are when people recognize something's wrong, right? If you only knew, well, even Chicago from our criminal statistics, you'd think it was a horrible place to live. Happily, the criminal statistics do not affect absolutely everybody in the city, as horrific as they are, right? And so it's hard for us reading accounts of the accidents and crimes to keep it in perspective of how many people of the whole population it affects. Which is not to say that life expectancy tended to be a bit low, because accidents were quite frequent. And Hannawalt talks about they're good coroner records that, for England in particular, that show us some of the toddler deaths are terrible, right? They fall off things and they get run over and fall into wells, and it's yes, it was dangerous, but people were upset by it then too.
Well, I wanted to go back to, we were talking about women in the Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. And I saw a post about a year or so ago, I think it was by Paul Elam, but he was making comment that the name Webster is a very common name now, but back then it referred to Webster and Brewster were female titles of jobs. I think Webster was a female weaver and Brewster was a female brewer. Mm-hmm. And it's like, we say, Middle Ages, just so horrible for women. It's like, then how do have these names existed and become so popular now?
Well, and so again, I can keep giving you references. One of my teachers, Sharon Farmer, just published a book last year on the guild workers in Paris. And women were very, very prominent in the silk working textile industry. So the Webster part, that I think that must be what that women were often involved in spinning thread and things like that. And Sharon has very good details on, again, for the period that you're looking at for Paris, actually 13th century, but it'll give you a good sense. And what's interesting is, of course, there are also things like she's also been interested in how some of the weaving techniques that they use for silk are brought by Saracens. It seems like I heard a talk at Kalamazoo this spring. William Jordan, who it sounds like you're reading some of his work if you know about the famine. He's doing some research on how Louis the Ninth. Am I saying Louis the 11th? Louis the Ninth. Why don't I know my Louis? Oh my gosh, King Louis, Saint Louis brought converts, Saracen converts from the Holy Land to settle in France, and whatever expertise they brought with them, some of those seem to some Saracen textile techniques seem to have been known in France in the later period. Now I've gotten. Why don't I know which number the saint was? I'm gonna have to look that up.
You've been
it's horrible not to know.
Good on like everything. I'm just amazed how much you're able to pull off the top of your head.
Yes, so well, not knowing which number of King Louis is just dreadful.
Okay, so I'm going to take a couple of questions from the chat. The first one, what's up?
Ask your questions.
The first question is, did the Vikings have a writing system?
Not one that gave them any sort of way of writing down anything more than names or runes, right? They just have like inscription. All we have of actual Viking writing is inscriptions. So the stories that we have of, say, Norse mythology, the most famous ones are written down in the 13th century by Snorri Sturluson, and he's writing them centuries after the Scandinavians have converted to Christianity. So writing is a Christian technology as far as, and a Jewish technology, but it's a Mediterranean technology that's brought north by the Christians. So
another question, I'm not fully understanding this, but it says
Louis the Ninth, not Louis the 11th. Good grief, Louis the Ninth, Saint Louis.
If there were no police, how did crimes get prosecuted?
Oh, that's a great question. So that's why the different legal systems are so fascinating to study. And what develops in England, which develops the common law, is one that you have juries of the townspeople who they're not juries to whom the evidence is presented and then they make a judgment. They're juries who know the evidence, and they're assembled and asked, right? And one of the things that happens in the Middle Ages is there's very complicated systems of jurisdiction over who gets the right to hold the court when you fine people for crimes and such. And if it's the king's court, the fees of justice go to him, but they're lords' courts and they're abbots' courts, and so forth. So you don't have the police. You have whoever's jurisdiction it is you're in, whose court you appear before. And what we do have from England are very extensive records of some of these courts where it's either the king's representative or the lord's representative or the abbot's representative who hears the cases, right? And so it would be whether or not you could bring a case to the court and plead it and make your case well enough for the court to award you that verdict. As to how they're not yet, you're right that there's not like Scotland Yard is a 19th century development as well. The church develops people who go around and look for crimes or heresy, we call them inquisitors, earlier than everybody else, right? And their job from the 13th century was indeed to go around and ask people about their faith and ideally to change their minds if they found people that had wrong beliefs. But the court system is one something I don't know as in detail as I'd like, and two, very localized from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and it depends on the country that you're talking about if you want to have details about that. Yeah, I can give you places to go look for that, but that's the rough sketch.
Another question,
and it's Louis the Ninth. I'm going to keep saying that because I'm so embarrassed that I didn't know that.
So another question from Louis the Ninth is about spoons.
Okay.
They've
Spoons.
seen metal knives and forks, but not found spoons until quite later on. I'm not sure how this is a question, but that's what they're saying. So,
Okay, I have no idea. If you want
spoons
table manners, the most interesting book is a book by Norbert Elias called The Civilizing Process, which goes through a number of these etiquette manuals, which are very, very interesting. I do this sort of riff on how blowing your nose becomes kind of civilized over the period. Most people at sort of fine table had a knife, right? And they ate with their fingers, right? So you cut your food up, and then and so the cleanliness practice was to have finger bowls and to wash your hands and then to wipe them. Forks are I thought forks came in later than spoons, but you start with knives in your fingers and finger bowls to keep your fingers clean.
So let's talk about chivalry, because that was one of the things that was mentioned in your post. Can you give us a brief about what it is and how it came about?
Well, there's the question, right? What I said in my 3 Cheers for White Men was chivalry is a good thing because it convinces, and I did it in a sort of joking way, right? It convinces men that it's not a good idea to rape women and instead serve them as nice.
Angry when I first read that, but I'm like, no, maybe she's joking. Let me give her the benefit.
No, I was serious, because you need. I mean, this is my most serious claim. You need Christianity to have that value, and that it is a respect for all human beings and respect for all women, and an expectation that even when the peasants get married, it's. What do you mean?
Oh, you froze there for a moment.
Even when the peasants get married, it as a marriage, it is constituted by both of their consent, right? That was my second cheer, that sacramental marriage as consensual is developed as a concept in the 12th century. I have in my blog, after everybody got upset with me for saying chivalry was a good idea, I did a series of posts going through the sort of problem of understanding what chivalry means. And it as with all of these concepts, it's a very layered claim. I started closer to the present with chivalry. I said American style, and I'm making a quotation from Tocqueville, who's writing about America in the early 19th century. And he said, American women were, much freer than the women in France in his day, and very independent and would go about sort of without apparent concern in public. But he explicitly said that the men take rape as a crime so seriously that if anybody dares to attack one of these American women in the 1830s, he will be very severely punished. And I say, see, this ideal that we have that American women should be free in the public sphere goes back really to the early part of our history. That probably comes out, here I brought in Walter Scott, to chivalry Scots-Irish style, that there is an expectation, particularly from the northern part of the British Isles, the border countries, that women are there as sort of helpmeets and warriors with their lords. And I think in that post I used a image from Rob Roy's, or no, maybe which one was I think it was Rob Roy. Yes, it was, of his wife showing up as this sort of terrifying warrior to defend him who has been taken prisoner by the English. So that, that image of the woman standing by her man and being sort of powerful and strong is well developed in Scotland, at least, or at least in Walter Scott's telling in the 18th century. Take that back to chivalry, sort of Arthurian style. I said, well, one of the interesting things that develops out of the Arthurian literature is descriptions of, sort of what a proper knight should be. And there's one 13th century story that I referred to that it's called Lancelot of the Lake. It's the prose Lancelot. And Lancelot grows up being taken care of by the Lady of the Lake. And when he's old enough, she gives him armor. She doesn't want him to leave, but he wants to go off and be a knight. So she gives him his armor and gives him some instructions on what it means to be a knight. And this sort of expectation that the knight should have a particular kind of virtue is developing in the period. And what she tells him is, you serve Holy Church and you protect women and children, basically. I mean, she's a little more detailed than that, but that there's, that the knight is the one who's supposed to protect the poor, not pillage them, to serve the Holy Church, and to respect women. And what all of my colleagues in medieval studies said, howling at me, was, well, that doesn't, men still raped. And I'm like, that's not my point. It's they're censured for it. Right. One of the stories that I think is representative here is from the 100 Years' War, in Froissart's account of the sack of Limoges by the English. And if what my colleagues are saying, that knights were, celebrated for rape, is true, why then Froissart, who is best known as the one who's sort of fantasizing chivalric moments at the Battle of Crécy when he's an idiot and should know better, and, stuff and so forth, specifically says the Black Prince was wrong to let his men loose in the town in this, the Limoges had resisted them, never mind. Christians don't do this, right? Well, next post in the chivalry series, Vikings did, right? And I did this contrast chivalry sort of around between 1033 and I can't remember what the dates were. There's a major transformation that happens in the 11th century when these pagans are converted and become Christian knights, that I find it curious. We typically in our modern culture celebrate Vikings. It's like, oh, they're cool. And you make video, you make Netflix series about them and so forth. And they're barbarous, murdering thugs. Hurrah! And they're icky to women. What's interesting is that we don't believe that about Crusaders anymore. We make movies like Kingdom of Heaven about them and make them, bloodthirsty, murdering thugs. Crusaders did not use rape as a weapon of war. They did kill civilian populations when they took besieged cities, particularly in the first campaign after they'd been starving outside of Antioch for 8 months. But unlike, for example, the Muslim armies, they very specifically did not use rape as one of their weapons against the civilian population. And that comes out of, most people understand, a movement called the Peace and Truce of God in the 11th century, in which even kings took oaths not to attack the civilian population. Now, again, it doesn't always hold, but there's a standard by which they are called to penance, saying, that this is an inappropriate way for a Christian warrior to behave. Obviously, anything that you're actually studying with proper historical attention will have multiple layers like this, and say, how do we get to Tocqueville by the early 19th century saying American men take rape as a very serious crime and make sure that anyone who assaults their women is punished appropriately. But of course, these are other people in the community that are raping. And so when do you first start seeing a population taking rape seriously as a crime? Well, it would seem to be sometime in the Middle Ages.
I am very glad that you went through all of that, because truthfully, I only had your one post to work off of, and it's very easy to assume the worst of someone based on what little they said. So that's why I wanted to give you the benefit of the doubt of what you were saying. And I think you cleared that up, because... Well,
all of those posts are linked at the bottom of the one you read, right? It's just their links, and you have to follow them. So if you go to 3 Cheers for White Men, there's a list at the bottom of this series, right? And that was what I said. I mean, in terms of how do we carry on difficult conversations like this, is like what I said to my colleagues who'd come and called me a white supremacist and a misogynist for making that claim about chivalry was, thank you. I need to explain this, right? I need to go into detail. Clearly, a one sentence phrase is not persuasive.
I'm just kind of contemplating all of it, but it's like, because that's something that we definitely have today, and I think that's something that you've encountered, that yes, rape is super, super bad, and but when we look at the actual numbers of men who actually commit rape, we're not even talking about 1% of the population.
Right.
And I now understand what you're saying, that it's Christianity that basically taught not to rape, that we need Christianity for this sort of thing. I'll have to look into that more, but you've given me an interesting thought with that. But it's hard for me to imagine that, unless we're talking about really oppressive third world countries like today, that the concept of rape, there's always the bad people, there are always the rapists, but the majority of the people are not going to do it. And it's hard for me to imagine that any more than 1% of the people back then were capable of this crime.
Well, that's a very politically difficult thing to wonder, right? Because it's the question about the relationship between the culture and people's behavior, and the degree to which it's, what's natural and what is culturally expected. And in modern Western cultures, men just you grow up knowing that you do not rape women. That people are claiming that men are taught to rape women in our Western culture boggles my mind. I do not know where they're getting that, unless they watch Game of Thrones or something. I don't know, right? It's interesting because I have no idea where the argument comes from, saying that our young men are encouraged to rape. It's really literally exactly the opposite. And I say that's, coming out of chivalry, because it's a claim that comes from Christianity, but also the Jewish scriptures that Christians share with Jews, that you care. But Christianity also is very strong on this. You care for the widows and orphans, right? You care for the women. And if knights in the Middle Ages engaged in rape, they were considered to be sinning, and it was horrible. I'm reading a book right now about the Crusades, about the interaction between Christianity and Islam. In Islam, it was a little different, right? That they did believe that it was appropriate to take the women whose cities they captured and rape them, and that was one of the things that they did. It's in their own chronicles, and they said that they celebrate this. And I was just reading about the fall of Jerusalem in 1187, and many of the women who were living there, the Christian women who were living there, were captured, enslaved, and raped. Right. So I think it's hard to know exactly how to answer that question as a human problem, because Western men are so acculturated by Christian expectations.
Well, to answer your sort of question a moment ago about, men being encouraged to rape, I don't really believe that is the stance that a lot of these staunch people have today. I believe their approach to it is they look at rape and it's like, well, the majority of people who rape are men, so that must mean that men know not to rape, so we need to teach them not to rape. And the sad part about this, the really sad part, is that when you actually look at the numbers, really look at the numbers, men and women rape in equal numbers, and you're only focusing on half of the problem. So there's a lot of victims who are silenced in that process. And then on the other half of it, you're telling these people that they're bad, they're horrible, they're rapists, and, they need to basically self-flagellate themselves. I know I'm mispronouncing that.
Flagellate. Peter Damian could teach you how to do that. He was the first great proponent of literal self-flagellation.
Oh, I already have a flogger. I like to slap my back every now and then.
If you were doing it properly, you'd be saying the Psalms while you did it.
Yeah, I'm not going to do that.
People need to be taught how to behave sexually. I don't think that, and that's one of the curious things about us as a species. You'd want to say, how do you socialize the sexual instinct? And I think you're right that both men and women need appropriate instruction as you're growing up to figure out what, this awkward relationship is, because men want to have sex with women and women don't want to have sex with all men. And so how do you negotiate that? And who says yes to whom, right? And I went back to, the idea of marriage as a sacrament as developed in the 12th century. And I've already had arguments with colleagues about this too. I say, from what I know from reading the canon lawyers, they're very specific about, well, it's consent, right? The sacramental element of it is, and that's why in a marriage ceremony, you say, I do, and I do. And so like in The Princess Bride, the joke about whether or not the bride has said, I do, well, then you're not married. That entirely depends upon this 12th century discussion that says, well, is it's the consent that makes the mystery, right? And if you've determined that the appropriate relationship between the sexes depends on both of them consenting, I obviously think that's the best value you can have, and the most appropriate negotiation that people need to go. Now, how you get there is obviously, then we end up with an incredible literature for the last 1,000 years of how men and women, talk to each other. And we should be continuing to explore that, what level of intimacy and relationship seems to be best for, raising good families and making, virtuous individuals.
I 100% agree with you, but I'm just thinking about our current PC culture right now on this idea that men and women are the same, boys and girls are the same, and that's actually going to hurt a lot of social interactions and future sexual interactions, because if people are told that they are the exact same, then they're not going to know how to properly represent themselves to, one, get that consent. I'm not saying they're going to rape, but we're just not going to, our
men and women are utterly, completely differently motivated. However, one of the things that I think is most sad is that men are also motivated to want children. I mean, there is, the young men I know who've recently become fathers are just proud as all get out, right? And it's interesting to me that neither, young women are not encouraged to become mothers. It's considered beneath them to change diapers. And it's like, you're taking care of a whole nother human being, and you're entirely responsible for that person's life for some years, to keep them alive, to cherish them and nourish them and care for them. You're crafting a soul by way of your behavior with that person. And you think that's beneath you? Excuse me? It's horrible. And I heard that, I heard that in a professor giving a graduation speech to our class this past spring, and she's saying, women, you shouldn't just be changing diapers. And I'm like, wow, one, it's not that hard. You clearly haven't done it. And two, exactly how is that beneath you? And my best phrase is this: it's like women who will stand up and say it's beneath them to change diapers will then spend 20 years picking up after their cat. Pets, I'll scoop poop for my dog for years, but I won't change a diaper. Excuse me. But on the other hand, men are also ennobled and honored by taking responsibility as fathers. And I think the worst thing that we've done in our culture is somehow devalue parenting. It's amazing that we seem to spend most of our time trying to figure out how to get out of it.
That is definitely true, but I think what you're saying, that there's a lot of men out there that really want children. And unfortunately, we live in this culture where a lot of men who wanted are denied from it. Not because they can't find a partner, but maybe they do find a partner and then that partner changes their interest. Either getting an abortion, putting up for adoption, keeping the father out. And it's like, this man wants that responsibility, and yet he's being denied that responsibility.
Exactly. Abortion kills a child, but it's not, we don't probably want to go there, but yes, so what I understand is chivalry in the proper sense. And you say, what's different about it now, right? It does develop in the 19th century. And there are ways in which, of course, chivalry, all virtues can be transformed into vice by lying and hypocrisy. That certainly, claims of chivalry have been misused to say, I think it's interesting saying, that if men, say women are not capable of doing this or that, and that's unchivalrous. It's like, well, men's desire to protect women is also quite important and strong there. And there's certain things that maybe, it's not in the women's best interest to participate in, like warfare. I'd really rather the men take care of that. But that chivalry should be, you know, this understanding of negotiation and mutual responsibility, and in both directions, right? The man takes responsibility for caring for a family, and the woman recognizes that he's done that, right, and respects him for it, and vice versa, right? So this mutual respect for differing roles, I have no idea how that turned into something that we weren't supposed to value. I mean, that's where I'm absolutely utterly with Milo. Feminism is cancer in the way that it's devalued some of the most precious relationships that we could have, either as spouses or children, as parents.
I didn't know if you're a feminist or not.
Well, I am a better I have, my feminist lineage is impeccable. My great grandmother went to college. You cannot touch me. And not, you know, she was in Arkansas, right? I learned that from my uncle, that my great grandmother was one of the first woman to graduate from college in Arkansas in the late 19th century. All of my grandmothers, both of my grandmothers went to college. My great aunts, great aunts on both sides. No, women's intellectual abilities, very, very important to foster. Have no problem with that. What we've done is take that and like corrupt it as an ideal, and it's fascinating to watch, you know, something that is you know, definitely a social good, which is educating women, and transform it into a way to bash men. Where did we get that?
Yeah. And that's a thing that concerns me on college campuses. I'm curious if you've noticed this at all, that, you know, less and less men are graduating from college, that there's now a majority of women graduating.
What's funny, what I think about that is, it's funny because you have the sort of, if you have the American frontier myth, you always have the school marm and the sheriff or something. The sheriff falls in love with the school marm. I like that story. That, you know, women do seem to gravitate towards teaching. And one of the things that, of course, I mentioned my grandmother, is that, you know, I have a lot of the women, these college educated women in my family were teachers. My grandmother was a high school teacher, taught Latin and English. My father's mother and my mother's mother set up the daycare in her small town in Texas, right? So they, you know, the foundation of institutions from my female relatives. School, as we have it set up, one, serves two very interesting functions. One is to create sort of a citizen factory, right? The kind of late 19th, early 20th century Dewey model of, you know, Prussian citizens pushed through our state-supported schools. But it obviously also benefits, or, you know, tends towards more women-friendly styles of learning. Whereas men you need to recognize that men and women learn different kinds of skills differently and better. And you know, clearly the American universities are serving women better than they are men. And so men are going other places to learn. A lot of you guys are on YouTube talking to me now. So I'd say that's, you know, that's good. It's saying you care about learning history and, you know, about theology and philosophy and so forth. Those are not inherently feminine disciplines, but how you engage with them, obviously temperamentally, is different. And that should be the argument why we want both women and men, because we have different temperamental, you know, strengths as things that we're interested in, and things and ways that we learn.
Well, and I'm in favor of having, like, and I know how bad this sounds, but a segregation of gender, that boys learn in an all-boy environment and girls learn in an all-girls environment. And while there should be still some social interaction between the two, boys and girls do much better in a single-gender environment.
Well, you could say yes. That what we're living through right now is the effects of everybody going co-ed in the universities, and it maybe it's not as happy as people imagined it would be. It's stressful in ways that we are not very good at dealing with, and that's what that in my understanding is what the campus rape culture is about. It's young people being horrifically anxious about how to interact with each other. And I was, you know, I'm old enough or young enough, I'm not sure, old enough to look back on my time in college to say, you know, it was fun, but there, you know, some boundaries probably would have been helpful, and they weren't there.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad for some of the development we have, because, you know, we all deserve the right to be happy. we deserve the opportunity to be happy. We deserve.
It's so American of you.
What's up?
It's very American.
Thank you.
Well, and women have been educated in the Western tradition all along, right? Then again, it's Christian. It's the expectation that literacy is good. I can tell you long stories about female literacy from the Middle Ages too. That's some of the things that I've looked at more closely. That women are closely associated with teaching their children to read in the period. So
it's funny because in my book, I have a character. He's married, but he's away from his wife, and she writes him a letter. And my editor actually criticized me for that. It's like during the Middle Ages, it would be unheard of for her to be able to read and write. And it's like...
your editor's wrong.
So, well, we're about coming to a close on this. We're about reaching 90 minutes. And my Lord, this has been very illuminating. I think how much. I mean, I've definitely learned a lot, and you've got me... You set me in the right direction for a lot of things. I know I have like 90 books to read now, so
that's what's fun about history, right? There's always more to read. So if indeed you want more to read, I have on my academic homepage, if you've seen that, home.uchicago.edu/tilde-R Fulton. Google me, Rachel Fulton Brown. I have syllabi for all my courses there, and and some reading lists and things like that. So if you're interested in reading more, that's the first place I would send you to look at what I've already posted.
Well, the thing I also love about talking to you, because like I said, I've done a lot of my own research, and some of it's been on track and others have been a lot of misinformation. That's the thing that I hate, is I feel like I've been lied to all of my life. When it comes to history, that it's been very bastardized, it's been very stripped down to very basic things. It's like when we covered medieval history in school, it went from the Romans to the Industrial Revolution, and very little was covered between there. It was like maybe a chapter, and it's like there's so much more that needs to be taught. But then it's like, you know, there are so many bad things that are not talked about, or so many things that are blown way out of proportion to what is actually done. I feel like the school system is not actually teaching the truth about history. And I think this is where a lot of misinformation comes in your circle about the things you're talking about, and you're able to back up. You say, this is where I got it from. This is what you have to read to understand what I'm talking about here. But no one wants to do that. They want to believe the bastardized version of history they have. And it makes me concerned that, you know, they say you've got to learn history or you're doomed to repeat it, that we're starting to repeat history.
Okay, so that's one. What we repeat is human nature, right? History, it doesn't really repeat itself, but what people are people, and you can see certain patterns of interaction repeating themselves. But my favorite phrase about that is from Scott Adams, whom you might follow, the cartoonist. I have it put up outside my office door. It's like, people who do not study history are doomed to repeat the things that appear in history books, but never actually happen. So yes, keep reading.
All right. So, oh wait, someone has a question. Let's see if we can get this in. Here's a question. Is it true that Switzerland didn't give women the right to vote until the 1970s? I don't know why you want to ask a medieval professor.
Yeah, I don't really. The thing is, it may be right. The women's suffrage is a 20th century phenomenon for the most part, although they're advocating for it from the 19th century. But the thing about women's suffrage you need to realize is it parallels men being granted the vote. It's one of those things like. What you were saying, in the past, you have this, oh, women are treated like cattle, and then suddenly they're, it's all enlightened. That the arguments for women's political participation come at the very same time as the arguments for expanding men's political participation too. They come out of the late 18th century, and that it took the 19th century to persuade the rest of the men to say that the women should participate in the same way as the men. They're also trying to convince each other that men without property can vote and so forth. So it's very much a modern conversation. Women in the Middle Ages participated politically in a lot of different ways that, the queens have negotiating power. They are intercessors quite often. If, favorites at court, you have what you mentioned with, your character writing a letter to her husband. Women were very often left, as the heads of households while their husbands are off on campaign, and they are expected to run the household. So what you think of as political participation changes with what the politics are from the period. And certainly women had very significant political power at different times in different ways in the past. And our present configuration is democratic representative government by way of suffrage. So we expect women to be able to participate in that. But it feels like that's another topic.
I can answer the Switzerland question, at least from the research that I've done.
Oh, good.
That is actually true. Women didn't get the vote until 1970 because the way Switzerland's run, I believe it's called an open democracy, where while they do have political figures that they elect, the majority of any decision gets made is by the voters themselves.
Mm.
So it wasn't until 1970 that a majority of the men in Switzerland allowed women to have the vote.
Mm.
So
I still bet their wives were influencing them. But anyway.
Oh, direct democracy. Yes, that's what it's called.
Yeah. Good.
Okay.
So Louis the Ninth. God, hope I never forget that one again. Louis the Ninth.
Hashtag Louis the Ninth.
Hashtag Louis the Ninth. I was born in St. Louis. I should know what my saint city's number was.
Was he named? Was St. Louis named for Louis the Ninth?
He's the only saint. He's the only St. Louis. All the others are just numbered.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm not too good on the aristocrat just yet, or the nobility, whatever you want to call it. I'm studying. There's like a lot to study, but I'm getting there. But I'm self-taught, so I have an excuse. So where can people find you? I know you have a blog.
So I'm Fencing Bear at Prayer, which is a blogspot blog. You can also find my YouTube channel, which is Three Craters Symposium, which is not just me. It's a group of friends. We have wit, wine, and wisdom in hopefully erudite and fun conversation. And my homepage that I mentioned, Rachel Fulton Brown, where I have listed syllabi, reading lists from my courses, my publications. Yes. And I'm on Facebook. You can find me on Facebook as Rachel Brown.
I'll definitely find you on Facebook. So I thank you for coming on this channel. Like I said, this was a very exciting thing for me because I've done so much research, but you've now helped put a lot of things into context. So now when I go back and look at it, I'm like, I have a good foundation.
Good. I'm happy to hear it.
Thank you for that. All right. So I thank everyone for coming, checking out my channel. Be sure to check out my description box below. You'll find my Patreon, where I'm trying to save up money to buy insurance because I'm disabled. If you don't want to do Patreon, understand I also have my book down there. My PayPal if you want to do that. Or you can buy my book, How to Destroy Women Now, which is a spoof on how to destroy men now. That book contains illegal information, so I'm hoping that I can get enough feminists pissed off at my book that Amazon will take both books down. So buy it, give it a good rating.
Good goal.
Well, maybe if I could get Milo to put on his page. Milo, if you're listening, I want to be on your website somewhere. So yeah. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. I appreciate all the questions you have. Hopefully, I got to all of them. Rachel, you have been fantastic, and I definitely invite you to come back if you want to do more medieval in the near future.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
All right. Everyone take care.